Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. We're your source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development, where we share original research, explore industry trends, and interview executives and thought leaders from across the globe. We hope you join us often for practitioner-oriented content around all things related to leadership, HR, talent management, organizational development, and change management. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with Human Capital Innovations Podcast. Do you enjoy the Human Capital Innovations Podcast? Please subscribe, leave a review, comment, share, and consider supporting the podcast on Patreon, even at the producer and sponsorship levels. Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. In this HCI Podcast episode, I talk with Deepa Purushot about how women of color can redefine identity and power in the workplace. Deepa Purushot, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
So excited to be here. Thank you.
It is great to be with you today. You're joining us on this beautiful Monday morning from the LA area. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. And today we're going to be talking about how women of color can redefine identity and power in the workforce. Now, I'm coming to this conversation as a straight cisgender white dude, but you come to this conversation as a woman of color. And so I'm really excited to learn from you as we go through this dialogue and hopefully expand my understanding and thinking in this area, and hopefully we can do the same for listeners as well. As we get started, I wanted to share Deepa's bio with everybody. Deepa Purushot is the co-founder of Information, which provides brave, safe new spaces for professional women of color and a women and public policy program leader in practice at Harvard Kennedy School. Prior to this, Deepa spent more than 20 years at Deloitte and was the first Indian woman to make partner in the company's history. Deepa was also Deloitte's National Women's Initiative Leader, the firm's renowned program to recruit, retain, and advance women. Deepa has degrees from Wellesley College, Harvard Kennedy School, and the London School of Economics. She is an Aspen Fellow and speaks extensively on women and leadership. She has been featured at national conferences and in publications, including Bloomberg Businessweek and the Harvard Business Review. What a stellar background and set of accomplishments. Clearly tons of insights that you're going to be able to add to this conversation. Anything else you would like to share with my listeners by way of your background or personal context before we dive on in?
Yeah, maybe just the book. And so I had a book that came out March 1st of this year. It's on women of color and finding power in corporate America. And I interviewed over 500 women of color to write that book. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, yes, draws from my own experiences, but also draws from the stories of over 500 women of color.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And we need to be telling those stories more and more. I was having a conversation with a consultant in the DEI space last week. And that was really the crux of what we concluded was there just needs to be far more storytelling so that we can develop more empathy and understanding for the various circumstances and contexts in which people are trying to just navigate this world. And it's messy, it's hard, it's a fraught space when you're trying to have these conversations in the workplace. And especially when you get a bunch of white dudes like myself, collectively, there tends to be just insecurities and defensiveness and those sorts of things. And so all of that just needs to be broken down. And the best way to do that is through storytelling and to help people walk in other shoes a little bit, at least a little bit, to better understand where they're going.
That's exactly why I wrote the book and why I did it the way that I did. I could have probably talked to 20 women and told the stories, but I really wanted to have the breadth across industry and across ages and across experiences. And so it was really important to have that. I'd also just share just to kind of set the stage, because I have been doing so many, talks around the book that I feel like everyone's in the position that you're in. Like, this is such a fraught topic. It's so hard. But I also want to share, I think it's hard for women of color. Part of what's challenging is we haven't talked about these issues. We've talked talked about them in small groups or maybe privately, but we haven't really talked about them a lot because there hasn't been reward for talking about them or even acknowledgement that the differences exist. And many of us, what was most fascinating in interviewing all these women of color is very few of the women of color I interviewed were taught how to talk about race at home. So many of us didn't grow up talking about it. So it's not like we know how to do it either. We know how to tell our stories, of course, but I don't know that we always have the words around race or what the experience looks like. And because there's so much denial growing up around what's happened or just keep working hard or doing more, I think a lot of us are still sorting through it. So I think we're all struggling is all I want to share on that side.
Yeah. And, I don't know as much about women of color specifically, but I know there's a good amount of research on gender differences and how it plays out in leadership styles and approaches in the workplace. And I suspect it's even harder for women of color than it is for women generally, but certainly for women generally, we know that it's just harder to navigate these gendered spaces. You're like walking a tightrope of trying to demonstrate all these competencies and capabilities without coming across and being perceived as too quote unquote too assertive or whatever, and I suspect for women of color that's even more of a tightrope. And so not only do you have the struggles of just trying to figure out how to put language around the experience that maybe you haven't been brought up talking about, but then you have this added layer of just the gendered differences in the workplace that make it even harder.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there. I think there's absolutely the experience of it being different, right? And not having the words for it or fully being able to even draw attention to it. In the book, I say that corporate America is not a meritocracy. And sometimes people seem shocked when I say it. And all I'm trying to really break apart is that our experiences are different. And you can't just assume everyone has the same experience, that there are nuances that we can talk about. The other thing is, right, there's stereotypes and microaggressions and racism that happen for women of color that, again, we haven't had full space to talk about. It hasn't been safe to talk about it. And almost all of the women that I interviewed had not just one story, but dozens and dozens of stories, if it's not happening on a weekly basis, then on a daily basis. And then on top of it, I think there are expectations and barriers around pay and advancement, even hiring, that show up differently for women of color because of the inherent biases many of us grow up with. And then finally, the extra roles that a lot of women of color take on that we don't really pay for or don't acknowledge, and things like culture building or talking about race after, a police shooting, or, really holding space to unpack the fact that many of us have very few sponsors and mentors, because there's so few leaders that look like us. And so really, what does that mean for the few that women of color that sit at the top? Some of the women that I interviewed, when I interviewed white women, they would say I interviewed 25 people, or I'm sorry, I mentor 25 people. Men would say I mentor a dozen. So we go from a dozen to 25 of its women. With the women of color, some of them shared with me they were, mentoring over 100, in some cases 200 women of color, because there's not that ratio. There's none of them available. And so there's just all these extra layers that we, again, don't talk about, don't reward, and don't acknowledge, that just make it harder to navigate and harder, I think, sometimes to succeed, and also balance just a lot of the health and the wellness issues that we've started to talk about as we emerge from COVID.
Yeah. And I also think, say there's a well-intentioned guy like myself, and I'm in a space and something like the George Floyd incident happens, and there's lots of public outrage and there's dialogue, and you recognize the need to have conversations. What tends to happen is that I immediately turn to the people of color in that kind of a situation. I immediately turn to the people of color to say, can you please help us with this?
Yes.
And so then it just adds to their burden. And
exactly.
And on the one hand, I want people to be able to tell their stories. I want to be able to understand and to walk with them and to have greater empathy and compassion and understanding. On the other hand, I can't expect for other marginalized populations and groups of people who have struggled with all sorts of things that maybe I haven't struggled with. I can't expect them to just bear that extra load and burden just to enlighten me and help me understand or feel better, and that's what often happens. So even if I'm super well-intentioned, if I'm not careful, that ends up happening, and it just adds to the load. It adds to the barriers, everything that you just mentioned.
Absolutely. And I also think we're in a moment, just to unpack the other side, because I'm talking to a lot of allies who I call co-conspirators. I want people to take action, not just kind of watch as bystanders. I think it's also fraught on, on your side, right? It's fraught because, I tell a story early in the book around airplanes. I interviewed Renee Myers, and she's the VP of Inclusion at Netflix. And we were talking, and she started talking about airplanes and how when she was a young mom, she used to really worry about, the luggage during turbulence that might fall on her young children. I jumped in right away because in my Deloitte partner role, I used to travel 3 cities a week. So I was on a plane, putting my luggage up and taking it down 6 times a week. And so here in this 5-minute conversation, she as a young mom was experiencing the airplane, this very small space, very differently. I'm 5'1". So that process of putting my luggage up is something I worry about before I get on the plane. I get very stressed about it. I feel like all eyes are on me, again, in a very small space. And if I'm sitting next to a taller gentleman, 5'10" or taller, he's not even thinking about either of those things. And so again, that meritocracy idea. But I also think what we're not realizing now, and it's funny, I did a few podcasts, and one of the podcasters asked me, so if I see you on the airplane, should I help you? Should I not help you? I'm not sure as a white man, like I don't know when to help and when not to help. And I share that analogy just to unpack. I think it's, again, confusing. People now don't even know when to intervene or how to help. And I just say, I think you have to ask questions. I think to your point, we have to have more empathy. We have to have more conversations. We have to get to know each other as people and understand how experiences show up differently. So then we can figure out when to intervene, when to just support, when to, when to maybe just kind of talk to the person afterwards. And so it is just a very confusing time, unfortunately, is what I want to say about it overall.
Yeah. And to your airplane example, I would say to that person asking the question, should I step in and try to help you put your luggage up or not? I mean, it depends, right?
Exactly. That's usually what I say. That's exactly what I say. Like
it totally depends on the person. And,
yes.
and so you might ask, and
yes.
certainly don't just go up and grab the luggage and start to put it up.
Exactly.
But yeah, it just depends. And so that's something that, maybe, again, this is kind of a gendered stereotype, but men tend to step in and just want to fix things for people. And so I might be well-intentioned. I might see that someone's struggling on the airplane. I might want to just go, jump to action and jump in and pick it up. But that's not my place. Right. But it's good of me to recognize that need and to want and be willing to help. But just then open up the dialogue and have the conversation. Say, hey, would you like some help? Something as simple as that can go a really long way. Exactly. And then multiply that 1,000 times by all the little interactions we have every day with people. Exactly. And I try to go through that mental exercise, and I'm sure I have so many blind spots, but I'm not a super tall guy, but I'm almost 6 feet. So that's tall, right?
Yes, it is.
I'm white. I don't consider myself particularly tall because I know lots of guys that are 6'2", 6'4", whatever, right? But I'm definitely taller than the average person. I'm a white man. I have all these layers of privilege, and I sit back and I try to think, what am I taking for granted that other people have to stress about, have anxiety over, and have to spend a lot of time and energy navigating? Yeah. Right. The answer is there's tons of things, and I'm aware of some of them, and others I'm just completely not aware of. And the luggage thing, honestly, before you shared that example, I'm not sure I've ever once thought about it.
Yeah. And that's usually the response. And again, I tell that story in the book because I also say only 2 to 3% of designers were actually women when that, stowage was designed. And so part of what I'm trying to unpack is that situations and environments and workspaces were also not necessarily defined with us sitting in those seats. So they show up differently, like temperatures and even seat heights and table heights and all those kinds of things. And so it's just something to unpack. Again, I'm not saying everyone is a bad person. I'm saying so the environment doesn't necessarily work. So what do we need to do to lean in to kind of actually adjust it or make changes so it does feel more comfortable? It does feel like more of us belong, because that's the big topic that is even more difficult to really unpack here. Is my sense of not belonging when I get on the plane in those first few minutes is huge because of that you may or may not feel, right? Because you're maybe struggling with other things, like, is there enough leg room for me? Like it's a different conversation in your head. And so just understanding that, I think, is really part of this. And so I think we just need to have more conversations. I think we need to be more open. I think we need to understand, to your point, that a lot of us have struggled struggled through this from childhood. Like I've never seen anyone on television until the last couple of years that looked like me. None of my teachers looked like me. I grew in a completely white town. I was one of 5 students of color in school. Again, we didn't talk about race at home. So I navigating these spaces, like with things, incidents happening, comments being said, and not really having the understanding of their tools to realize that's really race and what we've been taught that has less to do with me as a person or me as, my insecurities or my issues or my, like I didn't trigger that. That's really about the other person. And so understanding that, like putting words to that, and then, as an adult being able to take, responsibility for what's mine and what's not in workplaces, I think is also what this work is about for women of color. I think a lot of us navigate these spaces and don't feel powerful. And what I'm trying to teach us is that we can set up boundaries. We can say no, we can kind of recognize what's happening to us and find tools so that we feel better in these situations. Not that we're going to solve everything, but that we don't feel so powerless.
Check out my new book, The Future Leader, Creating and Transforming Next-Gen Organizations. Stemming from 2 decades of professional experience and over 600 in-depth interviews with executives, thought leaders, and scholars from across the globe, The Future Leader will help you explore the ordinary, everyday actions that will help you to prepare to lead in the future of work, to respond to an uncertain future, and to produce extraordinary results for individuals, teams, and organizations. Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Academy. Courses, micro-credentials, and certificates to upskill and reskill for the future of work. All HCI Academy courses, micro-credentials, and certificates are designed, developed, and delivered by award-winning and internationally renowned scholars, educators, thought leaders, executives, and practitioners. Our courses, micro-credentials, and certificates will help you make your mark on the future of work and make an immediate impact in your organizations. Check out the HCI Academy and our many course offerings and certificates to upskill and reskill for the future of work. Check out our new weekly LinkedIn newsletter, Alchemizing Human Capital, exploring industry trends via original research and interviews with executives and thought leaders from across the globe. We look forward to having you join us. Yeah. And let's talk about that. Some of those approaches, some of those tools that can help women, particularly women of color, redefine identity and power. That's the title of your book. So let's talk about that identity and power and how we can go about developing that.
Yeah, one of the examples I talk about in the book, and I think it'll speak to all of your listeners, so it's a good one, is around microaggressions and racism. I think that until recently, there was a lot of dialogue that those things don't necessarily happen in the workplace, or a lot of denial. And in the last 24 months, last 2.5 years, there's more recognition that incidents do happen in the workplace. And what I tell women of color is, it's going to happen. It's happened to you. When I say it's going to happen in the next 6 months, most women of color jump in and say it's going to happen in the next 6 days, right? Like it's pretty frequent. And some of the comments are really offensive, and some of the comments are, maybe unintentionally just not appropriate or really uncomfortable. And so I tell women of color, literally practice 3 things that you're going to say, because it's going to happen to you. So when an incident happens, when someone says something like, oh, you speak English so well, where did you learn it? And I was actually born here, right? Or, you're so articulate, I've never met anybody who, is of your race and so articulate. Like you actually have something that you can say. And so literally write out those 3 things. But then I also encourage women of color to practice saying them, because sometimes in the moment when those things are said, we are caught flat-footed. We are embarrassed. A lot of the women of color I interviewed feel pain and shame in those situations in a way that is really confusing, because they're not actually doing the saying, right? They're having the incident happen to them. And what I've started to tell, allies, again, who I call co-conspirators, is I want you to practice what to say too. What are the 3 things you can do when you are in a conference, room, or when you're on Zoom and someone says something that is uncomfortable? You're also allowed to say, can we just unpack that comment? Or can we pause the meeting and just talk about that? Or at the end of the meeting, I would love to come back and really discuss what was just said, because it didn't sit well with me. That can be something something that you do, like that's the airplane analogy. Do you do something or do you not? You're allowed to ask questions. And so literally writing those things out and practice saying them. So you're also not caught flat-footed is part of what this work is about. Again, it's in that moment, not feeling powerful. How do you actually take your power back?
So being thoughtful in advance, practicing specific responses that can help. Some people are great on the fly, great in the moment, but when stress and anxiety is high, even those who are just always seem to have the right words right on the tip of their tongue, even then it can be really challenging. And frankly, most people aren't like that in the first place. Most people don't have the exact right thing to say in the moment every time. And so you do just have to practice. You have to prepare. That can go a really long way. And to do it in a way where you can acknowledge what was said, what was done. It hurt. It is an unfortunate situation, but also not putting someone else necessarily. I suppose it depends on the situation, but we're not, for a small unintentional kind of a slight, not necessarily putting the person completely back in a defensive posture on their heels, but doing it in a way where it can open up dialogue so you can actually better understand each other. That's, what we want, I think, the vast majority of the time. And unless we prepare in advance, it's the likelihood of us saying the exact perfect thing in that moment is pretty darn slim. And so I think that's a really great idea and a great recommendation. Are there other stories from your book that you would like to highlight that really just help to illustrate some of these key points?
Yeah, there's one story I tell often because it was so impactful to me. I interviewed a Black woman in the Midwest, and she was part of a large consumer products company. When she joined her company, she knew she was the only Black woman in her department. What she came to find within 6 months is she was the only one in the entire company, and it was a pretty sizable company. And as we were talking about 40 minutes in, she shared with me that she believes she's the only Black person in her entire town, like maybe one of two or three. And again, we were having a pretty intense conversation, and she started to really start crying and really feel the weight of what she was sharing with me. And she said, Deepa, I don't know that I realized until this conversation how much I compensate or all the things that I do because I feel responsible for presenting or promoting all Black people in a good way. And, air quotes around good, right? What she couldn't even define what that was for me. And then she said, because I think I'm the only Black person my colleagues have ever met. And I feel very responsible. And in the book, I talk about 5 extra burdens or extra roles women of color take on. You brought up one, right? After a police incident, kind of the explaining of how that impacts me, that's culture, interpretation role. But here's another one. It's representing your entire race. And it wasn't just her, hers was an extreme situation where she literally said it changes what I wear, how I wear my hair, what I eat at lunch, what I talk about. And she went through a list of a dozen things. And again, really upset because she didn't even realize she was taking on those roles. And to be super clear, she's an accountant. She's not like an HR person. She's not a comms person. And yet she felt that was such a big part of her job and such a weighty part of her job. And she didn't even know that she was doing it. And so there's a lot to unpack there, but I share that story because I really want people and listeners to understand the kinds of extra things that women of color take on that we don't fully have words for and don't fully understand, and how that can really weigh on us. The other thing I would share is that 2 out of 3 women I interviewed were physically sick. So not just, mental state, well-being, types of conversations that I think we're having now, but physical manifestations of not being seen and heard in organizations. So skin rashes, headaches, adrenal fatigue, fertility issues. There's a list of about a dozen things. And so many of the women had these things. And I think it's a result, and, I've talked to enough doctors and doing the research, of not being in full voice, of really having to conform and, contort and produce in these situations where they don't feel like they can be themselves, right? Where they feel like they can rise and lead in the ways that feel authentic to them. So I think there's a lot to be said. And so that's really what I've tried to do in the book, is to really lay out how the experience of women of color is different in workspaces so that more people can understand it, so that we as women of color can decide which ones we lean into and which ones we don't do. But as co-conspirators or allies, so people can really understand and unpack how is it different, and then figure out how we can work together to make it better.
Yeah, and you've already made a few references to this, but let's talk a little bit more about allyship and how people like myself can be a more impactful ally, one that is actually helping. Because it's one thing for me to have a good intention, but it's another thing, I might inadvertently do or say something that actually makes things worse, that actually undermines what others are trying to accomplish. You've already mentioned, for example, practicing the types of things that I can say. I think that's a really great piece of advice. Other thoughts or ideas on how to expand our ally network and how people like me who are trying to be allies, what we can do in preparation and in the moment to make more of a contribution?
I think one is really understanding that we are just beginning to create safe spaces in workplaces and really starting to listen in different ways. You know, after George Floyd's murder, a lot of companies did soundings with people of color employees. And when I go into companies, often CEOs, white CEOs will say to me, white male CEOs will say to me, like, my Black and brown employees tell me how it is. An hour later, if I go sit with those Black and brown employees, I hear a completely different set of stories. And so understanding we're just early in the process of creating safe spaces, creating places where people are telling their truth, and that just a one-time town hall isn't going to fix it. And that listening is I think we have to listen in different ways. And so that's the first part. I think the other part is really understanding that as leaders, you know, as co-conspirators, we have to give ourselves permission to get it wrong. Like, you're not going to get it right every single time. And I would rather you try and step in it than not try. And so it's important to be brave and courageous and even a little uncomfortable and give yourself permission and grace to get it wrong. Those are probably the most important things.
I keep on coming back to something you said just a minute ago, where ultimately it can be so challenging for anyone from, you know, a disadvantaged or marginalized population to navigate a various set of contexts that for them, maybe you've just been born and raised in this context and you don't even recognize the toll it takes on you. I suspect that's often the case. Like, you just don't even recognize the full toll because it's just it's been your existence. It's how you've functioned in the world your entire life. And so we need to create safe spaces where people can unpack those things for themselves, where they can then share their story and be their authentic self and share their truth with others around them. And then we need spaces where allies and co-conspirators can also assist in that process to create these safe spaces. You mentioned a minute ago about just the health effects, for example. My goodness, I just can't even imagine the extra levels of stress and anxiety, the weight that you would just carry with you walking around every day with some of these types of things that I just don't even have to deal with. Now, do I have stress and anxieties that I have to deal with? Yes, but I don't have those things. And so what extra level of burden? And then we know that stress and anxiety leads to other challenges, mental health challenges, depression, but also physical manifestations. So unless we can really create these safer spaces, we're going to continue to have higher levels of negative health outcomes, burnout, and other things that only contribute to keeping the equity gap in place, the equality gap in place. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a lot of different fronts we need to kind of approach this on, but let's start and meet people where they're at, and let's have the conversations. Let's move beyond the conversations to start actually, taking a good hard look at the policies, practices, procedures, those norms that are embedded in the workplace that may often have zero relevance to anything other than it's just the way we've always done it. Let's disassemble that and really do things that make sense for people. All of that can only happen as we have these conversations and better understand each other.
I think that's absolutely right. I think we need to create spaces like we talked about. I think we need to understand what policies and procedures don't work. A lot of the reporting processes within companies actually don't support women of color in telling their truth. They actually support the company. So to your point, there's probably less reporting is what the women shared with me than actual issues coming up. I also think we just need to get better at doing more. We did a research project with the Billie Jean King Leadership Initiative in the fall. And one of the pieces of data that I really talk about quite a bit is that 91% of the white women we interviewed, so we interviewed women of color and white women, 91% of the white women we interviewed said that they wanted to sponsor or mentor or support a woman of color, and only 9% were. So there's such a difference between intentions and follow through. And I think a lot of it has to do with where we are in the last couple of years. I think to your point, everyone's just surviving, not thriving. And so there's just not even that space, the gap between intention and doing. And I also just want to share, we also have a lot of women of color exiting, workplaces because of these issues in a very different level, in a very different way. 2 out of 3 women that I interviewed say that they're going to leave the workforce in the next year. And that was about a year ago. So I'm guessing it's even worse now. And so really understand the impacts of not starting to talk about this, not doing something different. There's such a desire and a race for talent right now, but you're also in a moment where women of color have more choices than ever before. And so if cultures don't change, if people aren't supportive, there's more places to go. And so that's kind of the interesting moment that we're in. We're talking about these issues at the same moment that, we're in a race for talent and are really looking for people to stay in their roles. And this is a real moment, I think, to really also make work for everybody. Like, even though my work is focused on women of color, a lot of what I'm uncovering are the challenges in workspaces in general. And emerging from COVID, what are the new questions we're asking about how we all want to work in the space that work takes up in our lives, and how do we do this differently so that it works for more people?
Yeah. Well said. Deepa, it has been a real pleasure. I note the time I need to let you run, but before we wrap up for today, I just wanted to give you a chance to share with listeners how they can connect with you, where they can find your book, and then give us a final word on the topic for today.
Sure. So you can find me on my website. So it's Deepa Puru, DEEPA, PURU.com. The book, The First, The Few, The Only, is available everywhere. So wherever you buy books, please go buy it. It's out now. And the last word is, I guess I would just leave with people with this idea that we all have power. We may not feel like it in the moment, but we all have power. And it's really about finding, your own boundaries and setting your own standards, and then finding others so that you're in community as you navigate these spaces. Whether you're a woman of color or not, we all need to find both of those pieces, our own voice, but also find others if we're really going to step into our power.
I love it. Deepa, it has been a pleasure. I encourage listeners to reach out, get connected, find out more about what Deepa can do for you. Check out the book. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week. Bluer Than Indigo Leadership, the journey of becoming a truly remarkable leader. Early in my adult life, I learned about an Asian proverb that translates as bluer than indigo. If you think about the color indigo, it is a brilliant, deep, and vibrant blue, what some would call the bluest of blues. To have something that is bluer than indigo is rare and truly remarkable. Contrary to popular myth, there is no one-size-fits-all or cookie-cutter approach to effective leadership. There is no silver bullet, no secret sauce, no go-to model that will solve all of your problems. The truth is, great leaders have all had their unique strengths and flaws, and have all had to discover and then pave their own distinctive path in their life's journey to fulfill their leadership potential. Bluer Than Indigo Leadership will help you discover your own path and explore those ordinary, everyday actions that will help you respond to an uncertain future and produce extraordinary results for your individuals, teams, and organizations. Check out Human Capital Innovations magazine, Human Capital Leadership. Human Capital Leadership is a free, interactive e-magazine with the mission to help individuals, leaders, and organizations find innovative approaches to maximize their human capital potential. We publish issues quarterly in August, November, February, and May. Take a look at the latest issue and let us know what you think. The alchemy of truly remarkable leadership. Ordinary, everyday actions that produce extraordinary results. Consider how the nature of work has shifted over the past 50 years. With increased globalization, rapid technological advancement, and the shift in economic composition, the average job of today looks very different than the average job of 50 years ago. What will the jobs and organizations of tomorrow look like? Moreover, what does this all mean for organizational leaders? What are the core competencies and capabilities of organizations and their leadership that are prepared for continued disruption and geopolitical and socioeconomic shifts? Regardless of what the future holds, increasingly, leaders need to be socially minded, data-driven, decisive, champions of talent, and disruptors of the traditional notions of leadership, teams, organizations, and work. The Alchemy of Truly Remarkable Leadership will help you to explore your own leadership competencies and capabilities and consider ways to apply and implement them into your workplace and personal life. Do you enjoy the Human Capital Innovations podcast? Please subscribe, leave a review, comment, share, and consider supporting the podcast on Patreon, even at the producer and sponsorship levels. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Human Capital Innovations podcast. I hope you stay healthy and safe and that you have a great week.